The neighborhood was quiet that morning. Children played on the porch of small painted houses, and the air was filled with the smell of freshly cut grass. It was the kind of street where people believed nothing bad could ever happen. But on that day, the peace broke apart with loud voices and the sharp sound of police radios. 3 officers walked with heavy steps, their hands near their belts. Their eyes locked on a woman who stood outside her home. She was tall, graceful, and wore a simple dress that swayed in the breeze. Her children watched from the porch, their small faces filled with confusion. The woman did not shout at first. She only asked why the police had come. Her voice was calm, but firm, and there was strength in the way she stood. The officers ignored her question. They had already decided in their minds what kind of person she must be. They saw only her skin, not the truth of who she really was. As they barked orders, neighbors peeked from their windows, whispers spreading down the street. The children clung to each other, fear rising in their eyes as their mother's calmness began to crack under the weight of insults thrown at her. The officers closed in, their voices louder now, demanding she kneel. She refused. She raised her head higher, her chin sharp against the sunlight. "I have done nothing wrong," she said, each word steady. The children gasped when one officer reached forward and shoved her shoulder. She stumbled but did not fall. Her eyes blazed, and in that moment, everyone watching felt a tension in the air that was hard to explain. It was as if the quiet woman before them carried a power hidden beneath her calm surface, a power even the officers did not understand. The youngest child cried out, begging the police to stop. But the sound only made the officers angrier. They moved as a group, trying to force her down. She fell to her knees, her scream echoing across the block, not only from pain, but from the rage of being humiliated in front of her children. Neighbors pulled out phones, recording. Some too afraid to step in, the children covered their ears, tears streaming down their faces. It looked like the end for her, a cruel moment where all dignity was stripped away. But then something changed. The woman stopped fighting against their hands and looked directly into the eyes of the officer. Holding her down, her gaze was sharp, unflinching, almost royal in its strength. Her voice came out low but carried across the air. "You will regret this," she said. It was not a threat shouted in anger, it was a promise, calm and certain. The officers froze for a heartbeat, unsettled by the strange weight in her words. None of them could explain why their hands trembled slightly or why the neighbors stared in silence as if they all felt the shift in the air. Emmett thought she was no ordinary woman. The truth of who she was had been hidden from them and from almost everyone who lived on that street. Her past was not one of weakness. She was known in places far beyond that neighborhood, respected in circles of power and feared by those who had once stood against her. Yet she had chosen a quiet life for her children. Far from politics, far from conflict, she thought she had escaped those shadows. But the police had dragged them back into her world with their arrogance. As the officers pulled her arms behind her back, her children screamed louder, their cries tearing through the air. The woman closed her eyes for a brief moment. She was not only a mother being humiliated, she was someone who carried history, someone who had fought battles for greater than this one. The neighbors did not know, and the officers did not care. But the truth would come out, and when it did, the shame would not fall on her, it would fall on those who had dared to lay hands on her. The siren of a police car wailed in the distance, growing louder as another vehicle approached. The officers kept their grip on her, yet unease showed on their faces. Her voice still echoed in their minds, that promise that their actions would not be forgotten. The children held each other tighter, their small bodies shaking with sobs. Neighbors leaned closer to their windows, waiting, sensing that something far greater than a simple rest was happening right in front of them. The woman lifted her head again despite her position on the ground. Her hair was wild, her dress torn, slightly, but her dignity remained unbroken. Her eyes shone with a fire that could not be crushed, and as she stared past the officers toward her children, she gave them the smallest smile. One meant only for them, a silent message of strength. She wanted them to see she was not broken. Not yet. Not ever. The police car stopped with a screech, and another officer stepped out. He was older, his uniform worn, his eyes sharp. The first 3 officers moved aside slightly, still holding the woman down, but waiting for direction. The older officer studied the scene, his jaw tightening as he looked at the crying children on the porch. He asked what had happened, and one of the younger men spoke quickly, claiming the woman had resisted arrest. The woman raised her head and spoke before the story could go further. Her voice was calm again, though pain lined her face. "You know, this is wrong," she said. "You know, I am not guilty of anything." Her words carried a quiet force, the kind that made people stop and listen even when they did not want to. The older officer narrowed his eyes. Something about her tone unsettled him. The children shouted for their mother, begging the officers to let her go. Their voices cracked with fear, and the sound drew more neighbors to their porches. Phones pointed at the scene, recording every moment. The younger officers shifted nervously. They had expected an easy target, someone helpless, someone voiceless. But instead they found themselves standing in the middle of a storm building faster than they could control. The woman struggled to her feet even as her arms were still pinned. Her dignity refused to bend. "Look at my children," she said to the crowd. "This is what they want them to see. A mother treated like a criminal when she has done nothing wrong." The neighbors murmured, their voices growing louder. Few stepped closer, though fear kept them from acting directly. Still, their eyes burned with judgment, not at her, but at the officers. The older officer ordered the others to put her in the car. They began pulling her toward the vehicle, but she did not resist with violence. Instead, she walked with steady steps, her head high. The strength in her posture seemed to accuse them more than any shouted words could. Each step felt heavier for the officers, as though the ground itself was reminding them they were making a mistake. One child broke free from the porch and ran toward her, but a neighbor caught him before he reached the sidewalk. The boy screamed and kicked, calling for his mother. She turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes, and gave another small smile, the same message of strength she had given before. The boy stopped struggling for a moment, holding that look deep in his heart. Inside the car, the woman sat with her back straight, her wrists bound, yet she looked more like a queen on a throne than a prisoner. The younger officers whispered among themselves, unsure if they had gone too far. The older officer avoided her eyes as he closed the door, because when she stared at him, he felt a weight he could not explain, like he was standing before someone far greater than himself. The children sobbed into each other's arms as the car engine started. The neighbors shouted now, some yelling at the police, others filming closely. The air buzzed with anger and disbelief. Everyone knew something about this was not ordinary. Everyone felt the sense that this woman was not who the police thought she was. As the car pulled away, the woman leaned back and closed her eyes. She allowed herself a moment of silence, but not of defeat. Memories filled her mind, moments from a past she had left behind, a past of power, leadership, and battles that shook nations. She had chosen to hide that part of herself to protect her children, but she understood now that she could not hide forever. The world had a way of dragging truth into the light. The older officer gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. He finally asked her name, expecting it to be ordinary, but when she spoke it, his stomach twisted. He had heard that name before. It carried weight in government halls, in whispered stories among officials, in the kind of circles where power was measured not by money, but by respect and fear. He glanced at her in the mirror, sweat on his brow. He suddenly understood what the younger men had not. They had not arrested a helpless woman. They had humiliated someone far beyond their reach, and he knew, deep inside, that this would not end with the ride to the station. The police car rolled into the station yard, its siren now silent. The woman sat inside, calm but unshaken, her eyes steady as the doors opened Officers nearby paused when they saw her. There was something about the way she carried herself, even in handcuffs, that made them hesitate. She did not look like an ordinary suspect. She looked like someone important, someone untouchable. The older officer tried to hurry her inside, avoiding the curious stares of others. He knew if word spread too quickly, questions would come that he could not answer. But whispers already followed them down the hall. Who was this woman? Why did she look so composed while being dragged through the station like a criminal? She stood tall, even as her wrists remained bound. "You are making a mistake," she said softly. Her voice echoed down the corridor, catching the ears of those who passed by. Some officers slowed their steps, watching her with careful eyes. They sensed there was more to her than they had been told. The children's cries still rang in her heart. She could picture their small faces pressed against each other on the porch, fear and confusion written all over them. That image filled her with strength rather than despair. She knew she must endure this moment, because her truth would not remain hidden much longer. At the desk, the younger officers spoke quickly, filling out reports, their words sharp with false confidence. They called her aggressive, resistant, dangerous, but their hands shook as they wrote, their voices cracking. The older officer avoided her gaze completely, ashamed yet unable to admit his fear in front of his men. One sergeant stepped forward to ask for her identification. She gave her name clearly. The sergeant froze, his pen hanging in the air. His eyes widened as he read the name again and again, disbelief spreading across his face. He whispered to another officer, and soon the room filled with murmurs. That name was not ordinary. It belonged to someone who had once spoken in front of leaders, someone whose words had carried weight in the highest places. She was not just a mother on a porch. She was a figure whose influence had shaped decisions, whose strength had been recognized far beyond the city. The sergeant looked back at her, realizing the danger they all now faced not from her, but from the truth of who she was. The younger officers grew uneasy as they noticed the shift in the room. They had thought they were in control, but the power balance had already begun to change. Neighbors' recordings were spreading online, and phones in the station buzzed with messages. People outside the station were beginning to ask questions. The woman finally sat down on the bench, her back straight, her chin lifted. She did not need to fight with her hands. Her presence alone was enough to unsettle the room. She turned her head slightly and looked at the older officer, the one who had first ordered her arrest. His face burned red under her gaze. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then she spoke. "You think you hold me here," she said, her voice calm but steady. "But the truth is already leaving these walls. My children saw what you did. My neighbors saw it. And soon the world will see it too." No one answered her. They did not know how. The younger officers shuffled nervously, their confidence strained. The sergeant cleared his throat, trying to bring order back into the room, but his voice shook when he spoke. The older officer walked away, his mind spinning. He had thought she was just another person to intimidate, another arrest to make, but he now understood he had struck against someone whose name could not be erased, whose voice carried farther than he could imagine. He had humiliated her in front of her children, and that humiliation would not fade. It would grow. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength. She had not planned to reveal herself again, not after choosing a quiet life, but they had forced her hand, and though she had endured their insults and their rough hands, she knew her true strength had only begun to show. Outside the station, the videos had already spread across the city. Neighbors had uploaded clips within minutes of her arrest, and those clips traveled faster than the officers could imagine. Strangers who had never met her were now watching the footage, their anger rising with every second. People saw the way she was shoved in front of her children, the way she stood tall even as she was dragged away. Hashtags began to trend, messages flooded social media. What the officers thought would be a small event had turned into a storm they could no longer control. Back inside, the woman sat calmly, her wrists still bound, Her silence was louder than any shout. The younger officers avoided her eyes, each one pretending to be busy with papers or calls. But they could not escape the growing weight in the room. Every passing moment brought more calls from outside questions, from reporters, from officials, even from people they could not name. The sergeant entered again, his face pale. He had just spoken on the phone with someone in a higher office. Someone demanding answers. He walked past the younger men and leaned close to the older officer. His voice was low, but the woman heard every word. Do you realize who she is? Do you understand what you've done? The older officer clenched his jaw. He muttered something about doing his duty. But even he no longer believed his own words. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at her. Again, she did not move, but her presence made him feel smaller than he had ever felt in uniform. A door opened, and a new figure stepped inside, a woman in a sharp suit, her heels striking the floor with authority. The room fell silent as she approached. She carried an air of command, the kind that turned heads even before she spoke. She introduced herself as the woman's lawyer. But everyone could tell she was more than that. She spoke with confidence, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. You will release her immediately, the lawyer said, placing documents on the desk. You have no grounds for this arrest. And every second you hold her, you dig yourselves deeper. The younger officers shifted uneasily, but no one moved to unlock the cuffs. The older officer straightened his shoulders, trying to regain control. We have procedures, he said, though his words sounded weak. The lawyer leaned closer, her eyes sharp. Procedures, she repeated. Your procedures ended the moment you laid hands on her in front of her children. The world has already seen it. Do you think you can bury this? The woman on the bench lifted her head slightly, a faint smile touching her lips. She did not need to speak. Her silence gave weight to the lawyer's words, and everyone in the room knew it. Outside, crowds began to gather. At first it was only a few neighbors who had followed the police car. Then came others, people who had seen the videos online, people who carried signs, people who shouted for justice. Their voices grew louder, echoing against the walls of the station. The officers inside exchanged nervous glances. They had thought this would end quietly, but it was only beginning. The air buzzed with energy, with the sound of people demanding answers. The lawyer turned toward her client. Stay calm, she said softly. This will be over soon. The woman nodded once. Her children's faces filled her thoughts, their tears, their small hands reaching out for her. She knew she had to return to them, not broken, but stronger than ever. The older officer walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. His face drained of color as he saw the size of the crowd outside. Reporters with cameras pushed against the barriers, their microphones ready. Protesters chanted louder, holding up phones that streamed the scene live. His chest tightened with dread. He realized there would be no quiet escape from this. The woman's name was no longer whispered only inside the station. It was now on every screen, every broadcast, every conversation. The truth of who she was had been revealed, and with it came a force the police could not silence. The noise outside the station grew louder with every passing minute. What had started as a handful of neighbors was now a sea of voices. The crowd stretched across the street, filling the sidewalks, holding signs and chanting her name. Some had come because they knew her story. Others simply because they saw the video and felt the injustice in their bones. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy. The younger officers stayed close to the walls, whispering to each other. Their faces were pale, their earlier bravado gone. They could hear the chants of the people outside, calling for justice, calling for her freedom. Each chant felt like a hammer striking down on their nerves. The older officer rubbed his forehead, sweat forming near his hairline. He knew the situation had grown beyond his control. This was no longer about one arrest. It was about the city, about power, about a truth that could not be hidden. He had wanted to show strength when he humiliated her, but now he felt weaker than ever before. The woman sat calmly, her hands still bound, her back straight. She did not need to raise her voice. Her silence carried more power than the shouts. Outside, she looked at the lawyer beside her and nodded slightly. The lawyer stood taller, ready to fight harder. Phones rang constantly. Higher offices were calling, demanding explanations. Some calls came from government leaders, others from organizations whose names made the officers shift uncomfortably. Each call carried the same message: release her before this grows worse. Yet fear of admitting their mistake made the officers hesitate. The sergeant walked over to her, holding a folder. His hand shook slightly as he opened it. Your accord, he muttered. It's clean. There is nothing here. His voice cracked, because the truth was heavier than the paper he held. There was not only nothing against her, there was also too much about her. Too many achievements. Too much recognition in places these officers could not touch. The woman looked at him with calm eyes. You already knew I had done nothing wrong, she said. But still you chose to humiliate me in front of my children. Her words struck deeper than a shout ever could. The sergeant swallowed hard, unable to reply. Outside, the chants grew into a roar. Reporters shouted questions at the station doors. Cameras flashed, capturing every face that appeared near the windows. The police knew that if they walked her out in handcuffs, the images would spread across the world within seconds. And if they released her quietly, it would already be too late. The truth had escaped the walls. Suddenly, the station doors shook as the crowd pushed closer. The chants thundered like a wave crushing. The lawyer raised her voice, sharp and commanding. Enough, she said to the officers. You will unkind her now, or the world outside will break down these doors to see her free. The younger officers froze. The older one clenched his fists, torn between pride and fear. But the pressure on him was too much. The calls, the crowd, the cameras, all of it was larger than his rank, larger than his uniform. His authority was crumbling. The woman shifted her wrists slightly, the cuffs clinking softly. She looked at him, her eyes steady, her voice calm but cutting. Decide, she said. Do you want to be remembered for justice or for shame? The older officer stared at her, unable to breathe for a moment. He knew the answer, though his pride fought against it. Slowly, with hands that trembled, he reached for the keys. The sound of the lock clicking open was small, but it carried through the station like thunder. The cuffs fell away, and the woman rubbed her wrist slightly. Though her dignity had never been chained, the lawyer smiled faintly, victory glowing in her eyes. The crowd outside grew wilder, their cheers echoing against the walls. The woman stood, tall and unbroken, her head held high. She did not thank the officer. She owed him nothing. She simply turned toward the door, ready to face the people waiting for her. The older officer lowered his eyes. He had thought he had power when he forced her to her knees. Now he understood the truth. She had always been stronger than him. The station doors opened, and sunlight poured into the dim hall. The woman stepped forward, her dress torn at the shoulder, her wrists marked by the cuffs, but her head held high. The roar of the crowd hid like a wave, rolling across the street, shaking the walls. Reporters raised their cameras, protesters lifted their signs higher, and her children broke free from the crowd to run toward her. She dropped to her knees and caught them in her arms, pulling them close, their faces wet with tears. She whispered softly to them, calming their cries. The sight silenced the crowd for a moment. All anyone could hear were the quiet sobs of the children and the strong, steady words of their mother. Then the silence turned into thunderous cheers. The lawyer stayed close by her side, shielding her from the cameras as much as possible. But there was no hiding her now. The world had already seen. The crowd chanted her name again and again, their voices rising as though they were lifting her higher with every word. The police stood at the doors, frozen. Their uniforms felt heavy, their badges dull under the eyes of so many witnesses. The older officer stepped back into the shadows, ashamed. His pride had been stripped away, his authority crushed not by violence, but by truth. He knew history would remember this day, But not his name, only hers. Reporters shouted questions, pushing microphones forward. Who was she? Why had she been targeted? What would happen now? The woman raised her head, her children still clinging to her dress. She did not shout or wave her hands. She simply spoke with calm strength, her voice carrying over the noise like a clear bell. You saw what happened today, she said. You saw how easily dignity can be taken away, how quickly judgment can fall on the innocent. But you also see now that truth cannot be chained. My children will not remember me as broken, because I am not broken. None of us are, the crowd roared, and her words spread through every phone, every broadcast, every corner of the city. People who had never known her name before now spoke it with respect. Leaders who had once sat with her in private meetings now watched, realizing her strength had returned to the public eye. Her children wiped their tears, smiling weakly, comforted by her arms round them. She kissed their foreheads, whispering promises of safety. She had protected them not with fists or weapons, but with the truth of who she was. That truth was enough to shake the city, enough to make the world listen. The lawyer touched her shoulder. Gently, you don't need to say more, she whispered. The world already knows. The woman stood fully now, her children at her sides, the crowd parting to make way. Each step she took was steady, deliberate, filled with quiet power. The chants followed her as she walked through the people, their voices rising higher than sirens, higher than hate. The police station behind her seemed smaller with every step. The officers who had mocked her were invisible now, lost in the shadow of her strength. Their names would fade, but hers would grow brighter dot at the edge of the crowd. She paused and turned one last time, her eyes sweeping over the sea of faces. Remember this day, she said. Remember that power does not belong to those who abuse it. It belongs to those who stand together, who protect each other, who refuse to bow to fear. The cheers that followed shook the street like an earthquake. Her children squeezed her hands, their faces shining with pride instead of tears. For them, she had endured the humiliation. For them, she had risen again and broken. And as she walked away with her family, the world finally understood who she really was. Not just a mother, not just a woman, but a symbol of dignity that no badge, no uniform, no insult could ever erase.